Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we drift back more than 1300 years into a Europe that smells of wood smoke, wet iron, and the particular dampness of a forest that has never once been properly drained. You are standing on the edge of a Frankish settlement, and the mud is doing its best to swallow your boots whole. Somewhere a blacksmith is hammering. A dog is barking at absolutely nothing, and a child is being born in a hall that smells faintly of last week's stew. That child, illegitimate, inconvenient, and almost certainly unwanted by half the people in the room, will one day be called the man who saved Christian Europe. And honestly, if you'd whispered that prophecy to anyone present, they'd have laughed you straight into the pigsty. Fair warning, by the way, the world you're about to enter is brutal, freezing, and absolutely teeming with people who would betray their own grandmother for a slightly larger plot of farmland, so you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love imagining all of you scattered across the dark globe listening together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here you are in a land that maps would later call Francia, though nobody living there thinks of it as a single tidy country. You trudge past timber halls and thatched roofs, and you quickly realize that the grand Roman world you half remember from school has crumbled into something messier. The roads the Romans built still cut across the landscape like the bones of a giant. But the empire that laid them is long gone, dead for over 2 centuries. And the people walking those roads now are the Franks, a confederation of Germanic peoples who swept in and made themselves comfortable. They are ruled in theory by kings of a dynasty called the Merovingians, men who trace their bloodline back to a possibly mythical sea creature, which tells you a great deal about the standards of believability at the time. But here's the quirky thing you'll want to tuck into your pocket for later. By the time our story begins, these Merovingian kings have become almost entirely decorative. Historians later gave them a wonderfully savage nickname, the Do-Nothing Kings, because that is more or less their full job description. You picture them paraded around on ox-drawn carts, hair grown long because long hair was the royal fashion statement, waving vaguely at crowds while someone else does all the actual governing. That someone else holds a title that sounds humble and is anything but. He is the mayor of the palace. And no, this is not the fellow who cuts ribbons at the opening of a new bridge. The mayor of the palace is the true power, the man who commands the armies, controls the treasury, and decides which decorative king gets to sit on the cart this season. You feel the cold seep into your shoulders as you understand the shape of this world. Power here does not flow cleanly from crown to subject. It pools and eddies around strong men, around warlords with loyal followers, around families who can raise an army from their own estates. Loyalty is bought with land, with gold, with the promise of plunder, and it evaporates the moment a stronger man walks into the hall. Historians still argue whether the Merovingian kings were genuinely feeble or simply victims of a brilliant propaganda campaign waged by the very mayors who replaced them. And you can chew on that mystery as you walk. Into this swirling, treacherous, mud-soaked world, a boy is born around the year 686. His name is Charles. His father is the most powerful man in the Frankish world, a mayor of the palace named Pepin, whom we will meet properly very soon. And his mother, here is where the whispers begin, is a woman named Alpeda, who is not Pepin's official wife. You catch the glances exchanged in the hall, the careful silences. Charles is, by the reckoning of the powerful people around him, illegitimate. A son, yes, a son of the great Pepin, but a son with an asterisk beside his name, a son whose claim to anything at all can be challenged, contested, and conveniently erased. You might assume with your modern sensibilities that being born out of wedlock in this era was a quiet social inconvenience, a raised eyebrow at a dinner party. It was rather more dangerous than that. In a world where inheritance meant the difference between commanding thousands of warriors and dying anonymous in a ditch, a contested birth was a target painted on your back. There were people, you will soon learn, who would very much prefer that little Charles simply vanish. The fringe footnote here, the one that delights me, is that the very name Charles in its Frankish form may share roots with words, meaning a free man or even a churl, a common fellow, which is gloriously ironic for a child who would father a line of emperors. Imagine naming your son something close to peasant and watching him conquer half of Europe. So picture him now, this infant swaddled and squalling, utterly unaware that the cold hall around him is full of ambition sharpened to a knife's edge. His father is aging. His father's legitimate family has their own plans, their own heirs, their own appetite for everything Pepin will leave behind. And Charles, the shadow son, the boy with the asterisk, is exactly the sort of loose thread that powerful families love to snip. You stand there in the firelight watching the smoke curl up toward the rafters, and you feel the strange weight of knowing what the room does not. That this inconvenient infant, dismissed and underestimated, is going to grow into the hammer that reshapes a continent. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. And tonight we have time, all the time in the world, to let the story unfold slowly. For now, simply hold the image of a divided land, decorative kings on ox carts, and a baby nobody important expects much from at all. So let us linger now with the man whose blood runs in that inconvenient infant, because to understand Charles, you must first understand the father who cast such a long shadow. Pepin of Herstal, they call him, sometimes Pepin the Younger or Pepin the Middle, because the Frankish nobility apparently believed that recycling the same 3 or 4 names across every generation was a charming family tradition rather than a nightmare for future historians. You will meet so many men called Pepin and Charles and Charlemagne tonight that you may begin to suspect the entire Frankish world was suffering from a profound shortage of baby name inspiration. Bear with it. Hold on to the threads. I promise the tapestry makes sense in the end. Pepin of Herstal is, by the time Charles is born, the undisputed master of the Frankish realms, and he got there the hard way, which is to say over the bodies of his rivals. You trace his rise back to a battle fought around the year 687 at a place called Tertry, where Pepin smashed the rival faction of Neustria and made himself the single mayor of the palace over both of the great Frankish blocks. And here you need a quick map in your mind, so picture the Frankish world as roughly divided into competing regions. There is Austrasia in the east, the rugged heartland of Pepin's own family, full of hard men and harder winters. There is Neustria in the west, wealthier, more Romanized, softer in the Austrasian imagination. And there is Burgundy in the south, plus the proudly independent Duchy of Aquitaine, further south still, which considers itself nobody's subordinate, thank you very much. These regions are perpetually jostling, allying, and betraying one another like siblings who share a bedroom and despise it. After the victory at Tertry, Pepin united these squabbling factions under his own firm hand, ruling in the name of those decorative do-nothing kings we met earlier. Remember them lounging on their ox carts with their gloriously long hair. Pepin let the kings keep their hair and their carts and their pageantry, and he kept the armies and the treasury and the actual decisions. It was a tidy arrangement that suited him beautifully. The mainstream historical fact to anchor here is simple but important. By dominating the office of mayor of the palace across all the Frankish lands, Pepin transformed what had been a court administrative post into something close to a hereditary monarchy in everything but name. He was functionally a king who simply had not bothered to claim the crown. Now here is where your inconvenient infant comes back into the picture, and where the danger truly sharpens. Pepin had a wife, an official wife, a formidable woman named Plectrude, and through her he had legitimate sons. Plectrude was no shrinking violet content to embroider by the fire. She was politically shrewd, ambitious, and fiercely protective of her own children's inheritance, and she had powerful family connections of her own that bolstered Pepin's position considerably. So when Pepin took up with Alpeda, and she bore him Charles, you can imagine the temperature in the household dropping several degrees. The quirky tidbit here, the one that historians enjoy poking at, is that some chroniclers of the period, who were often churchmen with strong opinions about marital propriety, were rather scandalized by the whole arrangement. There is a famous tale that a bishop named Lambert rebuked Pepin over the relationship with Alpeda and was subsequently murdered, possibly by Alpeda's own kin, which, if true, suggests that this was not a family you wanted to lecture about morality over dinner. You feel the precariousness of Charles's position now in your bones. He is the son of the most powerful man alive, yes, but he is the son who threatens the careful succession plan that Plectrude has built around her own line. To Plectrude, Charles is not a beloved stepson to be nurtured. He is a complication, a rival in waiting. Might one day challenge her grandsons for everything. And in a world where loyalty is bought and inheritance is contested at sword point, a complication like that is something a careful matriarch plans to eliminate before it can mature into a genuine threat. What makes this even more tangled is that Pepin's legitimate sons were not exactly thriving. One by one, in a stretch of grim luck, or perhaps something less accidental, Pepin's sons by Plectrude died before he did. You watch the family tree being pruned by fate, branch after branch, falling away, until the question of who would actually inherit Pepin's vast power became genuinely dangerously open. Historians still argue whether the deaths of Pepin's legitimate heirs were simply the brutal medieval mortality rate doing its grim work, or whether darker hands played a role, but either way the effect was the same. The succession that had once seemed settled was thrown wide open, and standing at the edge of that opening, unwanted but undeniably present, was Charles. You begin to understand the shape of the trap closing around him. With the legitimate heirs dwindling, you might think Charles's path would clear. Instead, it did the opposite. The fewer rivals stood between Charles and power, the more dangerous he became to those who wished to control that power themselves. Plectrude, watching her own sons die, was not about to let her husband's bastard sweep up the inheritance. If anything, the thinning of the family made her grip tighter, her resolve harder, her plans for Charles colder. The remaining heirs in her line were young grandsons, children, and a regent needed to rule in their name. And a grown, capable, popular Charles was the last thing a regent guarding child heirs wanted wandering free. So hold this picture as the fire burns low, a father at the peak of his power but aging fast, a formidable stepmother counting her surviving descendants and sharpening her plans, a handful of young grandsons clutching a fragile claim, and in the shadows a young man named Charles, son of the great Pepin and the controversial Alpeda, watching, waiting, and very much aware that the people who should be his family regard him as a problem to be solved. The solution they will reach for when Pepin finally dies is not a kind one. So the moment everyone in that smoky hall has been quietly bracing for finally arrives. In the year 714, Pepin of Herstal, master of the Frankish world, the man who turned a court office into a throne in all but name, falls ill and dies. And you can almost feel the whole realm hold its breath, because the death of a strong man in this era is never a tidy transition with paperwork and a respectful mourning period. It is the firing pistol at the start of a very ugly race. Power does not pass gently here. It is seized, contested, and soaked in betrayal, and the moment Pepin's eyes close, every ambitious soul in Francia begins calculating their next move. And the person who calculates fastest, who has in fact been calculating for years, is Plectrude. Remember her, the formidable official wife, the matriarch who watched her own sons die one by one and tightened her grip with each loss. With Pepin gone, Plectrude moves with the cold efficiency of someone who planned this long in advance. She does not intend to let the realm slip into the hands of some upstart warlord, and she certainly does not intend to let it slip into the hands of Charles. Her plan is to rule as regent in the name of her young grandsons, the children of her dead sons, keeping the vast Pepinid inheritance locked safely within her own line. And to do that, she needs to neutralize every possible rival. The most dangerous rival, the loose thread she has been eyeing since his birth, is the grown son of Alpeda. So picture the scene as it unfolds. Charles, now a young man in his late 20s, capable, popular among certain Austrasian warriors, exactly the sort of figure who could rally support, suddenly finds the world turning against him. Plectrude seizes the treasury, the gold and silver that buys loyalty and raises armies, and she secures the support of the nobles around her grandsons. And then she has Charles arrested. You watch him taken, this son of the most powerful man in the realm, and thrown into prison in the city of Cologne, which happened to be Plectrude's own power base, a place where her word was law and Charles had no friends to bribe the guards. Let us sit with that image for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the great low points in the whole story. Here is a man who within 20 years will be hailed as the saviour of Christian Europe, the hammer that shattered an empire's advance, and right now he is sitting in a cold cell, betrayed by his own family, stripped of his inheritance, with no army, no treasury, and no obvious future beyond a slow rot behind stone walls. If you had visited him in that cell and told him what was coming, he'd have assumed the damp had gotten to your brain. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is stark and humbling. The founder of the Carolingian dynasty, the grandfather of Charlemagne himself, began his rise to power not as a triumphant heir, but as a prisoner, locked away by his own stepmother, written off entirely by the people who held power. Now for the quirky tidbit, because even in this grim chapter there is a detail that delights me. Plectrude's choice of Cologne was no accident, and the city would loom large in the family's story. It was a Roman city, ancient even then, with walls and traditions stretching back centuries, and it housed treasures and relics and the apparatus of real authority. By keeping Charles there, under her thumb in the heart of her strength, Plectrude believed she had buried the threat for good. The fringe footnote, some chroniclers add, is that Alpeda, Charles's mother, may still have been alive and active during this period, and there are tangled hints that the family rivalries here were not just political but bitterly, viciously personal. A feud between two women and their bloodlines playing out across the whole Frankish realm. But here is the thing about locking away a dangerous man rather than dealing with him more permanently. It buys you time, but it does not solve the problem. And Plectrude, for all her cunning, made a serious miscalculation, the kind that historians love to dissect. She underestimated two things. First, she underestimated Charles himself, his resourcefulness, his sheer, stubborn refusal to accept the fate assigned to him. And second, she underestimated just how unstable the realm would become the moment Pepin's firm hand was gone. Because while Charles sits in his cell, the rest of Francia is descending into chaos. You see, the western Franks of Neustria, who had chafed for years under the rule of the eastern Austrasian Pepinids, seize the opportunity that Pepin's death and the resulting succession crisis presents. They rise up. They have no interest in being governed by Plectrude and her child grandsons, and they march to assert their own independence, even allying with outside forces. Suddenly, Plectrude is not the serene regent presiding over a stable inheritance. She is a woman besieged, facing rebellion from the west, defending the claims of children, and increasingly desperate. The very chaos she helped create by sidelining a capable adult leader now threatens to swallow everything she fought to secure. And in his cell in Cologne, Charles waits. We do not know exactly how long he languished there, and historians still argue whether his imprisonment lasted many months or stretched longer. But we do know that as the realm fractured around her, Plectrude's attention and her resources were pulled in a dozen directions at once. The walls that held Charles were strong, but the hands maintaining them grew weaker, more distracted, more overwhelmed by the unravelling situation. A guard here, a sympathizer there, a moment of inattention amid the mounting crisis. The opportunity that Charles needed was beginning slowly to take shape in the cracks of Plectrude's crumbling control. So hold him there in your mind as the fire dims tonight. A prisoner, yes, betrayed and forgotten by those who should have loved him, but not broken. Watching, listening to the distant rumours of rebellion seeping through the walls, waiting for the single moment when the careful prison his stepmother built would finally show a gap wide enough to slip through. That moment, you will be glad to know, is coming. So the moment comes, as moments like this always seem to in the lives of men destined for strange greatness, when the careful walls around Charles finally show their gap. We do not know the precise details, and this is one of those frustrating, tantalizing places where the chroniclers go quiet and leave us to imagine. But somewhere in the chaos of the year 715, as Plectrude's grip loosened and her attention scattered across a dozen crises, Charles slips free. Whether he was sprung by loyal sympathizers, whether a bribed guard looked the other way, whether he simply seized a moment of confusion and walked out into the night, we cannot say for certain. But you can picture it however you like. The cold stone at his back, the held breath, the heart hammering as he moves through the shadows of Cologne past the very walls his stepmother trusted to contain him, out into the open air of a realm coming apart at the seams. And here is where the story turns, where the broken man begins slowly to become the hammer. Because Charles does not flee into anonymity. He does not slink off to some quiet farm to live out his days nursing his grievances. He flees into the rugged eastern lands, into Austrasia, the heartland of his father's people, and he begins to do the one thing Plectrude feared most. He begins to gather supporters. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Charles possessed something his stepmother's gold could not fully replicate. He had a name, the name of Pepin, his father, and among the hard Austrasian nobility and warriors, there were many who remembered that name with loyalty, who chafed under Plectrude's rule, and who looked at this capable, determined young man and saw a leader worth following. You walk these eastern lands with him now, and you feel how different they are from the soft, Romanized West. This is country of dense forest and river valley of warriors who measure a man by his strength and his nerve rather than his paperwork. And Charles, you quickly realize, has both strength and nerve in abundance. He moves through the region, rallying men to his cause. A fugitive, transforming himself into a contender, gathering around him a band of followers bound not by Plectrude's purchased loyalty, but by genuine belief that this is the man who should lead. The quirky tidbit here is that Charles throughout his life seems to have had a remarkable gift for inspiring this kind of personal devotion. The sort of magnetism that makes hard men choose to die beside you, and you can already see it taking root in these early desperate days. But let us not romanticize too quickly, because the situation Charles steps into is genuinely dire, and his first attempts to assert himself go badly. The realm is a three-way mess. There is Plectrude holding Cologne and the treasury and the claims of her grandsons. There is the resurgent Neustrian faction in the west, who have thrown off Austrasian dominance and installed their own mayor of the palace, a man named Ragnfrid, and even raised up their own do-nothing king to lend themselves legitimacy. And now there is Charles the escaped prisoner, the third claimant, with his growing but still modest band of Austrasian loyalists. Three forces, all circling, all hungry, and the prize is mastery of the entire Frankish world. The Neustrians, sensing weakness in the divided East, go on the offensive. They march into Austrasian territory, and here is where you must brace yourself for a hard truth about your hero. Charles, in his very first major engagement, loses. Around the year 715, in an early clash, the inexperienced Charles is defeated. The Neustrian forces, more numerous and better organized at this stage, get the better of him. You feel the sting of it, this man who has just escaped prison and dared to dream of his inheritance, tasting bitter failure in his opening move. And the fringe footnote that historians sometimes raise is whether this early defeat was as significant as later, more flattering chroniclers suggested, or whether the Carolingian writers, eager to craft a redemption arc, may have shaped the narrative to make Charles's eventual triumph shine all the brighter against the darkness of these first stumbles. Because here is the thing about Charles, that you are about to learn the quality that defines him more than any battlefield tactic or political maneuver. He does not break when he loses. He absorbs the defeat, withdraws, regroups, and comes back harder. Where a lesser man would have seen that early loss as proof that the dream was impossible, Charles treats it as a lesson. He gathers more men. He studies his enemies. He waits for the right moment, the favorable ground, the lapse in his opponent's guard. Historians still argue whether Charles was a natural military genius from the start, or whether he was forged into one through exactly these early hard knocks, learning brutal lessons that smoother success would never have taught him. And there is something deeply satisfying in the idea of a man becoming great precisely because he was first allowed to fail. So the board is set. Plectrude clings to Cologne and her treasury. The Neustrians, flush with their early victory, pressed their advantage and marched deeper, even striking toward Cologne itself, where the desperate Plectrude is eventually forced to buy them off with some of that very treasure she had hoarded to keep Charles down. There is a grim irony you can savour there. The gold she seized to deny Charles his inheritance ends up flowing into the hands of her other enemies, weakening her further. And meanwhile, off in the eastern forests, Charles rebuilds his band of followers, growing his resolve, hardening his understanding of war and politics, deepening with every passing month. Hold him there as the fire settles tonight. No longer a prisoner, no longer forgotten, but not yet triumphant either. A man who has tasted both betrayal and defeat and refused to be destroyed by either. A fugitive turned contender, gathering his strength in the shadows of the eastern woods, watching his divided enemies exhaust themselves against one another. He has learned how to lose. Soon, very soon, he will begin the long and bloody education of learning how to win. And the first great demonstration of that lesson is waiting for him at a place called Amblève. So now you find yourself walking through the long, grinding middle of a civil war, which is rarely the stuff of clean heroic ballads, and far more often a slog of muddy marches, broken alliances, and the slow accumulation of advantage. Charles, having tasted defeat and refused to choke on it, spends these years doing the unglamorous work that wars are actually won by. He builds, he recruits, he cements his hold on Austrasia, the eastern heartland whose hard warriors have increasingly come to see him as their rightful leader, and he turns that loyalty into something Plectrude's hoarded gold never could an army that fights, because it believes in the man at its head. You feel the rhythm of these years as a steady tightening. Where once Charles was the desperate fugitive with a modest band, now he commands a genuine force, and crucially, he commands the loyalty of the region that produced his father's strength in the first place. The mainstream historical fact to anchor here is that Austrasia, the rugged eastern bloc of the Frankish world, there was the engine of Carolingian power across 3 generations, and Charles understood instinctively that whoever controlled Austrasia controlled the future. So he made himself indispensable to it, the defender of its interests against the resurgent West, the champion the Austrasian nobility had been waiting for. Meanwhile, his enemies conveniently for him keep tripping over their own ambitions. Remember the 3-way mess: Plectrude in Cologne, the Neustrians in the west under Ragenfrid, and Charles in the east. That 3-cornered struggle does not resolve cleanly, but it does shift in ways that favour the patient man. The Neustrians, flush with their early successes, overreach. They had marched east, even bullied gold out of the desperate Plectrude, and they had allied with outside forces to press their advantage, including the Frisians to the north, a fiercely independent pagan people who were no friends of Frankish unity. For a moment it looks as though the Western faction might sweep the board entirely. But here is the quirky tidbit that historians enjoy. The Neustrians, in their hunger to crush Austrasia, kept advancing into precisely the kind of terrain where Charles was strongest and they were most vulnerable, the dense forests and river valleys of the East Country that a defending local force could use like a weapon. They were marching in effect into Charles's home ground, stretching their supply lines, tiring their men, growing overconfident with each unopposed mile. And Charles, watching from the shadows of his forests, was learning to read exactly this kind of mistake. He had lost his first battle by meeting the enemy on poor terms. He was not going to make that error twice. You watch him refuse the easy, foolish path. A rasher man, stinging from earlier humiliation, might have charged out to meet the Neustrians head-on in open battle and gotten himself slaughtered. Charles instead does something that reveals the strategic mind quietly sharpening within him. He waits. He gives ground when giving ground is wise. He lets the enemy come deep, lets them tire, lets them grow careless and scattered, all while keeping his own force intact and his own discipline tight. The fringe footnote some scholars raise is that this patience, this willingness to trade space for advantage and to absorb short-term losses for long-term position, may reflect lessons Charles drew not just from his own defeats, but from older traditions of Frankish and even half-remembered Roman warfare, though the chains of that influence are murky and much debated. And this is the heart of the matter, the thing that transforms Charles from a defeated claimant into a rising power. He learns that war is not about glory or pride or meeting your enemy honestly on a fair field. War is about winning by whatever cunning the ground and the moment allow. He learns to use surprise, to use terrain, to use the overconfidence of his enemies against them. He learns that an army marching home loaded with plunder, certain the campaign is over, is an army that has dropped its guard. These are the lessons that will very shortly produce his first great victory, but even before that triumph you can see them accumulating, hardening into the instincts of a commander who will spend the rest of his life rarely losing. The Civil War also teaches Charles the colder art of politics. He learns that loyalty must be rewarded, that the warriors who follow him must be given reason to keep following land and plunder and the promise of more, and that an army is held together not just by belief but by the steady delivery of tangible spoils. He learns which nobles can be trusted and which must be watched, which rivals can be turned into allies and which must simply be destroyed. Historians still argue whether Charles was primarily a brilliant battlefield tactician or primarily a shrewd political operator who happened to also win battles, and the honest answer is that the Civil War forged him into both at once, because survival in this three-cornered struggle demanded nothing less. You can feel the momentum shifting now, slowly but unmistakably. Plectrude, weakened by her concessions, and her impossible task of defending child heirs amid chaos, is fading from the center of the story, her grand plan to control the inheritance crumbling in her hands. The gold she seized to deny Charles has been bled away. The grandsons she sought to enthrone are losing relevance with every passing season, and rising in her place in the East is the very man she imprisoned and dismissed, growing stronger, more confident, more dangerous. With each engagement he survives, and each follower he wins. So hold this picture as tonight's fire burns lower. A realm still divided, still bleeding, still uncertain who will master it. But within that uncertainty, a single trajectory growing clearer. Charles, the escaped prisoner, the man who lost his first battle and refused to be defined by it, is climbing. Not through luck, though luck plays its part, but through patience, cunning, and an iron refusal to break. He has gathered his army, he has secured his heartland, he has learned how his enemies fight and where they err. And now, as the overconfident Neustrians come marching once more into the forests of the East, certain that victory is theirs for the taking, Charles is waiting for them in the trees near a place called Amblev, ready at last to show the Frankish world exactly what kind of commander his imprisonment forged. So picture the spring of the year 716, and picture the Neustrian army marching home through the eastern forests, fat with success and heavy with the confidence of men who believe the hard part is behind them. They had come east, they had pressured Plectrude into handing over treasure, they had asserted their dominance, and now they are returning the way they came, certain that the Austrasian upstart Charles has been more nuisance than genuine threat. Their guard is down. Their column is strung out along the forest tracks, men and baggage and horses stretched thin between the dark walls of the trees. And somewhere in those trees, utterly silent, utterly patient, Charles is watching them pass. This is the Battle of Amblev, named for the river valley in the rugged Ardennes country, where it unfolded, and it is the moment Charles announces himself to the world as something far more dangerous than anyone had reckoned. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Amblev was Charles's first great victory, the engagement that established his military reputation, and he won it not through brute force or superior numbers, but through cunning surprise and a brilliant reading of his enemy's weakness. Everything he had learned in the bitter school of his earlier defeat he applies here with devastating effect. You watch how he does it, and it is genuinely beautiful in the cold, ruthless way that good tactics are. Charles does not line his men up for an honest battle. He has no interest in honest battles. Instead, according to the chroniclers, he employs a stratagem attacking the Neustrian force around midday, the hour when soldiers are weariest. When men are thinking of rest and food rather than danger, when discipline sags and watchfulness fades. Some accounts suggest he used a feigned approach or a diversion to fix the enemy's attention before striking from an unexpected quarter, falling upon the strung-out, unsuspecting column with sudden, overwhelming fury. The Neustrians, caught completely off guard, marching in the loose order of men who believe the danger has passed, have no time to form up properly, no time to bring their numbers to bear. The quirky tidbit here, the one that gives Amblev its particular flavour, is the role of surprise and possibly even theatre. Some chroniclers hint that Charles understood the psychological dimension of war, that a sudden assault from an unexpected direction does not just kill men, it shatters their nerve, turns an organised army into a panicked mob fleeing through. The trees, the forest that the Neustrians had marched through so carelessly, now becomes their enemy. The tracks that carried them home now choked with their own fleeing, dying men. And Charles, who chose this ground precisely because it would multiply the chaos, reaps the harvest of his patience. Let us sit for a moment with what this victory actually means, because it is more than just a tactical success on a single afternoon. Amblev transforms Charles's standing entirely. Before this, he was one claimant among several, a promising but unproven escaped prisoner with a regional following. After Amblev, he is a victorious commander who has crushed the dominant Neustrian faction in open warfare, and victory in this world is the ultimate currency. Warriors flock to a winner. Nobles who hedged their bets now lean toward the man who delivers triumph and plunder. The fringe footnote some historians raise is that the precise location and even the exact details of Amblev remain debated, with the chronicle accounts being relatively sparse and shaped by later Carolingian writers eager to glorify the dynasty's founder, so we must hold the romantic image of the perfect ambush, a little loosely acknowledging that the truth was likely messier than the polished legend. But debated details or not, the outcome is clear and consequential. Charles wins decisively, and in winning he proves that the lessons of his defeat have been fully learned. He has shown that he will not fight on his enemy's terms, that he will use terrain and timing and surprise without a flicker of shame, that he is willing to wait months for the right moment and then strike with merciless precision. These are the hallmarks of a commander who will over the coming decades win battle after battle and rarely taste defeat again. Historians still argue whether Charles was a self-taught military innovator or an inheritor of older Frankish tactical traditions. But what no one disputes is that at Amblev, the pattern of his generalship first becomes visible in full, the patience, the cunning, the lethal sense of timing. You can feel, too, how this victory reverberates beyond the battlefield. The Neustrian faction, which had seemed so dominant, is suddenly reeling its prestige, shattered its army, bloodied and broken in the eastern woods. The momentum of the entire civil war shifts in a single afternoon. Charles is no longer the underdog scrambling for survival. He is the rising force, the commander to be feared. And his enemies must now reckon with the unsettling realization that the man they imprisoned and dismissed has become the most dangerous figure in the Frankish world. Plectrude's grand design lies in ruins. The Neustrians are staggering, and into the vacuum strides the son of Alpeda, the bastard, the escaped prisoner, now crowned in the only way that mattered in this brutal age, by the blood of his defeated enemies. And there is something poetic, is there, not in the shape of it. The man who began this story, locked in a cell, betrayed by his family, written off entirely, has answered that humiliation not with words but with steel and stratagem. Amblev is his reply to everyone who underestimated him, to Plectrude who imprisoned him, to the Neustrians who beat him in his first outing and assumed he was finished. It is the moment the hammer first truly strikes, and the ringing of that blow echoes across all of Francia. So hold the image as the night deepens. The forest quiet again after the slaughter, the river running on as it always has, the broken Neustrian army scattered through the trees, and Charles standing victorious in the dappled light, no longer a fugitive but a force, his reputation forged in a single afternoon of brilliant violence. He is not yet master of the Franks. There are more battles to fight, more rivals to break, more years of struggle ahead. But the trajectory is set now, unmistakable and rising, and the next stage of his climb is the consolidation of everything this victory has won him. So the victory at Amblève, glorious as it was, did not hand Charles the entire Frankish world wrapped neatly with a bow, because nothing in this age was ever that simple. What it did was open the door, and Charles, having learned the value of relentless follow-through, was not the kind of man to win a battle and then sit back to admire it. He pressed his advantage, and the year after, Amblève brought another reckoning, this time at a place called Vinci, where Charles met the Neustrian forces once more and again broke them decisively. 2 great victories in close succession, and the message rang out across Francia with brutal clarity. The Austrasian heartland had found its master, and that master intended to rule far beyond its forests. You walk with him now through the work of consolidation, which is the part of empire building that rarely makes the ballads, but absolutely determines who survives. Winning battles is one thing, turning those victories into durable power, into a realm that obeys you and an army that stays loyal and rivals who stay defeated, that is the harder and slower craft. And here Charles reveals that he is not merely a battlefield genius, but a patient, methodical builder of power, the kind of leader who understands that a crown won by the sword must be held by something steadier than the sword alone. First, there was the matter of Plectrude. Remember the formidable stepmother, the woman who imprisoned him, who hoarded the treasury, who schemed to enthrone her grandsons. After Amblève and the collapse of her position, Charles turned his attention to Cologne, her stronghold, the very city where he had once languished as a prisoner. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Charles eventually compelled Plectrude to submit and to surrender the remaining treasure she had guarded so jealously. The gold that was his father's legacy, the wealth she had used as a weapon against him. There is a profound and satisfying symmetry in that moment, the prisoner returning to his prison city, not in chains but in triumph, taking back the inheritance that had been stolen from him, and doing it with the calm authority of a man who no longer needs anyone's permission. The quirky tidbit here, and it speaks well of Charles in an age not known for mercy, is that he did not, by most accounts, destroy Plectrude or her grandsons in the vindictive bloodbath that the era's customs would have permitted, and that many lesser men would have indulged. He had won. He had what he wanted. And rather than salt the earth, he largely let the matter rest once submission was secured. Some chroniclers present this as evidence of a certain pragmatic restraint in Charles, a recognition that needless cruelty breeds future enemies. Though the fringe footnote worth noting is that our sources are again shaped by Carolingian writers with every reason to portray their dynasties, founder as both mighty and magnanimous. So we hold the image of the merciful victor with appropriate caution. With Plectrude subdued and the treasury reclaimed, Charles set about the essential business of binding the Austrasian nobility to him with bonds that would not snap at the first sign of trouble. And this is where you see the true depth of his statecraft emerge. He understood, as his father had understood, that loyalty in this world is not a sentiment but a transaction, sustained by the steady flow of rewards. Land, plunder, offices, the promise of advancement. Charles made himself the indispensable source of all these good things, the wellspring from which the ambitious drank, and in doing so he wove the hard men of the East into a network of obligation centered entirely on himself. You can picture the mechanism at work. A warrior fights well in Charles's campaigns, and Charles grants him land, or the income from an estate, often land seized from defeated enemies or controversially from the church, which we will come to in due course. That warrior now has something to lose and someone to thank, and his loyalty is bound to Charles by self-interest as much as by admiration. Multiply that arrangement across hundreds and thousands of fighting men, and you have built something formidable. A military aristocracy whose fortunes rise and fall with their leaders' men who will follow Charles into any danger, because their own prosperity depends upon his success. Historians still argue whether this system of binding warriors through grants of land was a genuine innovation of Charles's, or simply an intensification of existing Frankish practice, but few dispute that he wielded it with unusual skill, and that it became a foundation of Carolingian strength. There is something else you notice in these years of consolidation, a quality of Charles that distinguishes him from the merely ambitious warlords who flared and faded across this age. He thinks in the long term. He is not content to be the strongest man this season. He is building a foundation, a base of power rooted in Austrasia, but reaching outward, an apparatus that will outlast any single battle or season of fortune. He installs his own preferred figures, maintains the polite fiction of the Merovingian kingship when it suits him, raising up a do-nothing king to lend his rule a veneer of legitimacy while keeping every meaningful lever of power firmly in his own grip. The decorative kings on their ox carts continue their pageantry, and Charles continues to rule. You feel by the end of this stretch how thoroughly the situation has transformed. The man who escaped a cell just a few years earlier, who lost his first battle, who began with nothing but a name and a band of forest loyalists, now stands as the master of Austrasia and the dominant power in the Frankish world. His enemies are broken or submitting. His army is bound to him by victory and reward. His treasury is restored, and his ambition, far from being satisfied, is only expanding, turning now toward the wider realm, toward Neustria and Burgundy and the proud independent duchies that have not yet bent the knee. So hold the image as tonight's fire settles into embers. Charles no longer fugitive or prisoner or underdog, but lord of the East, builder of a war machine and a network of loyalty, a man who has converted the lightning of battlefield victory into the steady, durable architecture of real power. The hammer has not just struck once at Amblev, it has begun blow by patient blow, to forge an entire realm to its will. And the shape of that realm and the formidable instrument Charles is building to defend and expand it is what we turn to next. So now we come to the years when Charles, master of the East and victor of two great battles, set about transforming himself from a successful warlord into something altogether more formidable, a builder of institutions, a reformer of armies, a statesman whose decisions would echo for generations. This is the period when the hammer truly takes shape, when the raw strength forged in civil war is hammered into a machine, and it is also the period when Charles begins to earn blow by blow the very name by which history would remember him. Because here is a detail worth pausing on. For all the talk of Charles Martel, the man was not born with that famous surname. He was simply Charles, son of Pepin. The epithet Martel, meaning the hammer, was attached to him later, and the mainstream historical fact to hold is that this name commemorates his ferocity in battle, the way he was said to strike down his enemies with the crushing, relentless force of a smith's hammer beating iron on the anvil. You can imagine how a name like that gets earned, not through a single dramatic moment, but through years of victories, through an accumulating reputation as the man who simply does not stop, who hammers and hammers until whatever stands against him is broken. By the time the name stuck, it fit him like a well-worn glove. But a hammer needs an arm to swing it, and Charles spent these years building that arm, which is to say building an army, the likes of which the Frankish world had rarely seen. And here we arrive at one of the most debated and consequential aspects of his entire career, his military reforms, and in particular, the question of cavalry. The traditional story, the one told for generations, is that Charles recognized the supreme value of heavily armored mounted warriors, and that he reorganized Frankish warfare around them, creating the seed of what would eventually grow into the medieval knight. To equip a man and horse with armor and weapons was enormously expensive, far beyond the means of an ordinary farmer soldier, and so the story goes. Charles needed a way to fund a class of professional mounted warriors. And this is where one of history's great controversies blooms, so let us handle it with care. The classic theory holds that Charles solved the funding problem by seizing vast tracts of church land and distributing them to his warriors, granting them the income from these estates in exchange for military service, especially mounted service. The quirky tidbit, and it is a genuinely spicy one, is that some older historians built an entire grand theory on this, arguing that Charles's land seizures, possibly connected to the introduction of the stirrup into Western Europe, triggered the whole development of feudalism and a mounted knight, a single chain of cause and effect supposedly, reshaping European society. It is a marvelous sweeping narrative. It is also, the fringe footnote insists, fiercely contested. Historians still argue whether the stirrup really arrived in time to drive these changes, whether Charles's reforms were as revolutionary as claimed, or whether this was a gradual evolution that later writers compressed into one dramatic innovation attributed to a convenient, great man. So enjoy the theory but hold it loosely. What is far less disputed is that Charles did seize church property, and that he did use it to reward and sustain his warriors, and that this earned him the lasting resentment of certain churchmen, even as it strengthened his military hand. You can feel the tension here, the pragmatic ruler doing what he must to fund his wars, taking wealth from monasteries and bishoprics that had accumulated vast estates, and redirecting it toward the men who fought for him. To his warriors, this made Charles the generous lord who provided for them. To a grieved clergy, it made him something closer to a despoiler, a plunderer of holy things, and there are later deliciously vivid legends which we will revisit, of Charles being condemned to torment in the afterlife for exactly this sin. The irony, which we will sit with properly in a later section, is that this supposed despoiler of the church would soon be hailed as Christendom's great defender. Beyond the cavalry debate, Charles built his military strength in more concrete and undeniable ways. He campaigned almost ceaselessly, and in this age constant campaigning was itself a kind of training, forging a body of experienced, hardened veterans who knew how to march, how to forage, how to fight in formation, how to win. He extended his authority outward through these campaigns, pushing into Neustria, into Burgundy, against the Frisians and the Saxons and the Bavarians, each expedition both expanding his power and sharpening his instrument. An army that fights every year is an army that becomes very good at fighting, and Charles made sure his did. He also built alliances and bound subordinate leaders to him through the network of loyalty and reward we explored earlier, extending that web ever wider as his power grew. He placed trusted men in positions of authority across the regions he subdued. He maintained the useful fiction of Merovingian kingship to lend legitimacy to his rule, and he governed with a combination of force and shrewd political management that kept his sprawling, fractious realm more or less in hand. You begin to see the full portrait now, not just a warrior but a ruler, not just a man who wins battles but a man who builds the systems that let him keep winning them. And all the while, far to the south, beyond the Pyrenees, beyond the awareness of most Franks going about their muddy daily lives, a great power was rising and expanding, a force that had swept across vast territories with astonishing speed and that was beginning in raiding parties and probing expeditions to spill over the mountains into the Frankish sphere. Charles, building his hammer in the north, did not yet know that the supreme test of everything he had forged was taking shape in the south, that all the years of reform and campaigning and army building were in a sense preparation for a single confrontation that would define not just his life but the future of an entire civilization. So hold the image as the embers fade tonight. Charles the Hammer, standing at the head of a war machine he has spent years building, reformed and hardened and bound to him by loyalty and reward, the most formidable military force in the Frankish world. He has the army, he has the reputation, he has the name, and gathering beyond the southern mountains, still distant but drawing nearer with each passing season, is the storm he was all unknowing built to meet. So let us leave Charles for a moment in his northern forests, hammering his realm into shape, and turn our gaze far to the south across mountains and seas to the source of the storm that is gathering. Because to understand why a battle near Tours would come to be seen as one of the hinges of history, you must first understand the extraordinary force that was rolling toward it, a force that had, in the span of a single century, accomplished one of the most breathtaking expansions the world had ever witnessed. You travel back then to the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century, where a new faith, Islam, had emerged and united the tribes of Arabia under a single banner with a speed and a fervor that astonished everyone in its path. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is staggering in its scale. Within roughly 100 years of its founding, the new Islamic State, under the early caliphates and then the great Umayyad dynasty, had conquered an empire stretching from the borders of India in the east, across Persia, across the Middle East, along the entire length of North Africa, an empire larger than Rome, at its height assembled in a handful of generations. You try to grasp the sheer momentum of it, kingdom after kingdom falling. The mighty Persian Empire shattered entirely, vast swathes of the Byzantine world, stripped away a tide that seemed to those who faced it very nearly unstoppable. And then in the year 711, that tide reached the western edge of the known world and kept going. An army crossed the narrow strait from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, into the land we now call Spain and Portugal, then ruled by the Visigoths, a Germanic people who had carved out a kingdom there from the wreckage of Rome. The quirky tidbit here is that the famous strait and its great rock take their very name from this moment, Gibraltar, deriving from the name of the commander who led that crossing, a man named Tariq, so that to this day the geography itself carries the memory of the invasion. The Visigothic kingdom, riven by its own internal divisions and dynastic squabbles, proved astonishingly brittle. In a single decisive battle, their king was killed and their power collapsed, and within just a few years the conquerors had overrun nearly the entire peninsula. You feel the dizzying speed of it. A kingdom that had stood for centuries gone in the space of a few campaigning seasons. The Iberian Peninsula, that great landmass at the southwestern corner of Europe, brought under Islamic rule, becoming the territory known as Al-Andalus, a name that would endure for centuries, and a civilization that would, in time, flower into one of the most sophisticated and learned in all the medieval world. But that flowering lay in the future. In these early decades, what mattered to the rest of Europe was the raw fact of conquest, the relentless forward motion, the sense that this expanding power did not seem inclined to stop at any particular mountain range. And there was a mountain range, of course, the Pyrenees, that great wall of stone separating the conquered peninsula from the Frankish lands to the north, from Aquitaine and Gaul, and everything Charles was building. But mountains history teaches us slow armies rather than stopping them, and the new rulers of Al-Andalus soon began to look northward beyond the Pyrenees, at the rich and divided lands of the Franks. The fringe footnote some historians raise is a debate over the true nature of these northward expeditions. Were they the opening moves of a serious, sustained campaign of conquest aimed at adding Gaul to the empire? Or were they primarily large raids, expeditions for plunder and reconnaissance, testing the strength of the lands to the north without a fixed plan to occupy them permanently? Historians still argue whether the forces that crossed the Pyrenees in these years intended outright conquest or large-scale raiding. The distinction matters enormously for how we judge the significance of what came later. Whatever their ultimate intent crossed the Pyrenees, they did, and the lands that first felt their weight were the southern territories, especially the Duchy of Aquitaine, that proudly independent region we met long ago, the one that considered itself nobody's subordinate. Aquitaine now found itself the frontier, the first line, the buffer absorbing the probing thrusts of an empire that had conquered half the known world. Raiding parties pushed over the mountains, striking at towns and monasteries, gathering plunder, and each expedition tested the defences and the resolve of the southern Franks. You can feel from this southern vantage how differently the situation must have looked to the people living it compared to the grand sweep we trace in hindsight. To the Aquitanians and the Franks of the south, this was not yet a clash of civilizations or a hinge of history. It was a series of terrifying, destructive incursions by a powerful and victorious enemy, raids that burned and looted, and then withdrew, each one a fresh wound, each one a reminder that the great conquering tide had reached their doorstep and showed no sign of receding. And to the north, Charles, busy with his own wars against Saxons and Frisians and rebellious Frankish factions, was only dimly aware at first of the gathering threat in the south, a threat that was steadily growing more serious with each passing year. The pieces you see were being arranged on the board by forces far larger than any single man. The astonishing expansion of Islam, the collapse of Visigothic Spain, the creation of Al-Andalus, the probing thrusts over the Pyrenees, the vulnerability of the divided southern Franks, and far to the north, the rise of a hard, brilliant, war-hardened commander who had just spent years forging the most formidable army in Francia. None of these elements knew yet how they would collide. But collide they would, and the place where the rising tide from the south would finally meet the immovable hammer from the north was being chosen all unknowing by the slow, grinding logic of history itself. So hold this image as the night deepens. A vast empire, young and victorious and seemingly unstoppable, lapping at the southern edge of Europe, its raiding parties spilling over the great mountain wall into the rich, divided lands of the Franks. And somewhere to the north, a man with a hammer for a name building and waiting, not yet aware that the supreme purpose of everything he has forged is drawing inexorably closer. The frontier is Aquitaine, and Aquitaine is about to be set aflame. So now you descend fully into the south, into the Duchy of Aquitaine, where the abstract threat we surveyed from a distance becomes a lived and burning reality, and where a single proud embattled man stands as the first wall against the rising tide. His name is Odo, sometimes called Eudo, the Duke of Aquitaine, and he is one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in this entire story. A man caught between two great powers, fighting desperately to preserve his own independence, while the world reshapes itself violently around him. You must understand Odo's peculiar position to feel the weight of what he faced. Aquitaine, remember, was that fiercely independent southern duchy that bowed to no one, least of all to the Frankish mayors of the palace in the north. Odo ruled it as very nearly a king in his own right, and he regarded Charles Martel not as his lord but as a rival, a northern power he was determined to keep at arm's length. So picture his predicament. To the north loomed Charles the Hammer, hungry to extend Frankish authority over the proud south. And to the south, beyond the Pyrenees, loomed the immense power of Al-Andalus, its raiding parties spilling over the mountains into Odo's lands. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Odo was effectively fighting a war on two fronts, struggling to fend off both the expanding Franks and the expanding forces of Al-Andalus, and the impossible strain of that double. Pressure shapes everything he does. For a time, against the odds, Odo held his own, and indeed he won a victory that deserves to be far better remembered than it is. Around the year 721, a large force from Al-Andalus laid siege to the city of Toulouse, deep in Odo's territory, and Odo, in a brilliant feat of arms, gathered his forces and fell upon the besiegers, shattering them in a great battle that broke the siege and inflicted heavy losses. The quirky tidbit, and it is one that genuinely irritates some historians, is that this Battle of Toulouse was arguably as significant a check on the northward expansion as the more famous battle that would come later. Yet, it is almost forgotten in popular memory, overshadowed entirely by the events at Tours. Odo, the man who first bloodied the invaders so severely, gets a fraction of the glory, while the lion's share goes to another. History, you will notice again and again, is rarely fair in its distribution of fame. But a single victory, however brilliant, could not end the pressure, and the raids continued, and Odo grew ever more stretched and desperate. And here he made a decision that would prove fateful, controversial, and ultimately disastrous, a decision that historians have debated ever since. Seeking to secure his vulnerable southern frontier, Odo entered into an alliance with a Berber leader, a regional commander within Al-Andalus named Uthman, sometimes rendered Munuza, who governed a territory in the Pyrenean region, and who had his own grievances against the central authorities of Al-Andalus. To seal this alliance, Odo gave his own daughter in marriage to this Berber lord. You can see the logic, cold and pragmatic. By allying with a discontented frontier commander, Odo hoped to create a buffer, a friendly power on his southern border that would shield Aquitaine from the larger raiding forces, while Odo dealt with the threat from Charles in the north. It was a clever gamble, and like many clever gambles, it failed catastrophically. The central authorities of Al-Andalus did not look kindly upon a rebellious frontier governor allying with a Christian duke and the new governor of Al-Andalus, a formidable and energetic commander whose name comes down to us as Abd al-Rahman, moved to crush the rebellious Uthman. The Berber lord was hunted down and destroyed, his rebellion extinguished, and Odo's carefully constructed buffer collapsed in an instant. Worse, the fringe footnote, some chroniclers add, is that Odo's daughter, the bride who sealed the doomed alliance, was captured in the aftermath and sent away, a personal tragedy folded into the political catastrophe. Though, as with so much in this period, the precise details are murky and the accounts romanticized by later tellers. Now Odo faced the full fury of a unified and vengeful Al-Andalus. Abd al-Rahman, having dealt with the internal rebellion, turned his attention northward across the Pyrenees with a great army, and this expedition was no mere raid. It was a powerful, organized force driving deep into Aquitaine, and it came in part to punish Odo for his treacherous alliance with the rebel. The army swept north, and Odo, gathering what forces he could, marched to stop it. They met somewhere along the river Garonne, and this time there was no brilliant victory like Toulouse. This time Odo was crushed. His army was shattered, scattered, destroyed in a defeat so total that the chroniclers describe the losses in apocalyptic terms. Historians still argue whether the chronicle accounts exaggerate scale of the slaughter, as medieval writers were fond of doing, but there is no doubt that Odo suffered a devastating war-ending defeat. And so you arrive at the moment that sets the stage for everything that follows. Odo, the proud independent duke who had spent his whole career keeping the Franks at arm's length, who had fought to preserve Aquitaine's freedom against both north and south, now found himself broken, his army destroyed, his lands open to a victorious enemy army marching ever deeper toward the heart of Gaul. He had no more forces to resist with. His buffer had failed, his alliance had backfired, his army lay dead along the Garonne, and the conquering force, flush with victory, pushed onward, plundering as it went, striking toward the rich monasteries and cities of the north, including, the sources tell us, the wealthy shrine at Tours. There was only one place left for the desperate, defeated Odo to turn. Only one power left in all of Gaul strong enough to stand against the victorious army now marching unchecked through the south. And it was the very power Odo had spent his entire life resisting, the northern hammer, the Frankish mayor of the palace, the man who was his rival and very nearly his enemy. Swallowing his pride, with no other choice remaining, Odo turned north and appealed to Charles Martel for help. So hold the image as tonight's fire burns low. The proud duke humbled his army, destroyed his daughter, lost his lands aflame, riding north as a broken supplicant to beg aid from the one man he had always refused to bow to. The frontier has collapsed, the buffer is gone, and the great victorious army of Al-Andalus is marching unopposed toward a collision with the only force left that might stop it. Section owns. So, picture the moment when these two proud men, lifelong rivals, finally come together. Not as enemies, but as desperate allies, bound by a threat larger than their mutual suspicion. Odo, the broken duke, arrives before Charles with his terrible news. His army destroyed the victorious force of Al-Andalus, marching unopposed toward the heart of Gaul. And Charles the Hammer, the man who had spent years hungering to extend his authority over the proud and independent South, suddenly finds the situation transformed. His rival comes to him as a supplicant, yes, but the threat Odo brings is one that endangers Charles every bit as much as it endangers Aquitaine. You can imagine the cold calculation running behind Charles's eyes. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Charles did not rush blindly to Odo's aid, and indeed some accounts suggest he extracted a price for his help, the submission of Odo, and the acknowledgement of Frankish overlordship, that Odo had spent his whole life resisting. There is a hard logic to it. Charles was not a sentimental man, and he understood that this crisis, terrible as it was, also presented an opportunity. By riding to the rescue of the South, he could at last bring proud Aquitaine into his orbit, accomplishing through this emergency what years of rivalry had not. The quirky tidbit is that even in the face of an existential threat to Christendom, the petty politics of Frankish power did not simply vanish, and Charles, ever the shrewd operator, kept one eye on the strategic prize, even as he prepared to meet the invader. Crisis and opportunity for a man like Charles were rarely far apart. But whatever the political maneuvering, the military reality was stark and demanded action. A powerful, victorious army was loose in Gaul, plundering as it advanced, and it had to be stopped. And so Charles did what Charles did best. He gathered his army, that formidable instrument he had spent years forging in the fires of constant campaigning, and he prepared to march south to meet the threat. You feel the gears of the war machine engaging, the summons going out across the Frankish lands, the hardened veterans assembling the men who had followed Charles through campaign after campaign, now mustering for the greatest test any of them would ever face. And here we must pause to appreciate the sheer difficulty of what Charles was attempting, because it was by any reasonable measure an enormous gamble. The enemy he marched to face was no ragtag raiding band, but a victorious army led by an able and energetic commander, an army that had just annihilated Odo's forces and that came from a power that had conquered half the known world. The fringe footnote that historians love to argue over is the actual size of the opposing forces, because the medieval chroniclers throw around wildly inflated numbers. Hundreds of thousands of men, figures that are simply impossible given the logistics of the age. Historians still argue whether the armies that met were many thousands strong or merely some thousands, but the honest truth is that we will never know the precise numbers, and we should be deeply skeptical of the enormous figures the sources provide. What we can say is that both armies were substantial, and that the stakes, whatever the exact head count, were genuinely momentous. You march with Charles now, through the late summer or early autumn of the year 732, or possibly 733, for even the date is debated. Another reminder of how frustratingly imprecise our knowledge of this pivotal moment really is. The Frankish army moves south, gathering Odo's surviving forces as it goes, marching to intercept the invaders before they can plunder the rich shrine at Tours and push deeper still into Gaul. And here Charles reveals once again the strategic patience that had served him so well at Amblève all those years before. Remember Amblève, remember how he waited, how he chose his ground, how he refused to fight on any terms but his own. The same instincts guide him now, on a far grander and more consequential stage. Charles understood that to confront a powerful, victorious and mobile enemy in the open on ground of their choosing was to invite disaster. The forces of Al-Andalus were renowned for their cavalry, for swift, hard-hitting mounted attacks, and to face such horsemen on open plains where they could maneuver freely was a recipe for the kind of catastrophe that had befallen Odo. So Charles maneuvered with care, seeking to position his army on ground that would blunt the enemy's strengths and play to his own. He sought wooded, hilly terrain ground that would constrain the enemy's cavalry, that would force them to come at him on his terms, where his disciplined Frankish infantry could stand and absorb whatever was thrown at them. There is a marvellous detail in the chronicle accounts that captures Charles's cunning. He is said to have moved his army by indirect routes, possibly to mask his approach, and his numbers arriving at the chosen ground and positioning his forces before the enemy fully grasped what they faced. Surprise terrain disciplined the same elements that had won him Amblève, now marshalled for the supreme test. The hammer had not forgotten the lessons of his youth. He had simply learned to apply them on the largest possible scale. And so the two armies drew together somewhere on the road between the cities of Poitiers and Tours in the rolling country of west-central Gaul, and for several days the sources tell us they faced one another without committing to full battle. Days of skirmishing, of watching, of testing each side reluctant to be the one to attack across unfavorable ground. You can feel the unbearable tension of it. Two great armies camped within sight of each other, the autumn air growing cold. The men on both sides, knowing that an enormous, perhaps decisive clash was coming, but neither willing to throw away their advantage by attacking first. Charles, holding his strong defensive position, was content to wait to let the enemy come to him, to let the burden of the assault fall on the invaders. So hold the image as tonight's fire settles. Two armies drawn together at last, after all the long roads that led here, the broken Duke and the Northern Hammer, united against a common foe facing the victorious force that had conquered half the world. The ground is chosen, the men are mustered, the tension stretches taut across the cold autumn fields, and the great collision that history would remember as the Battle of Tours, the clash that some would call the salvation of Christian Europe, is about to begin. Word count 1064 is greater than is greater than is greater than awaiting continue. So now you stand among them in the cold autumn light, packed shoulder to shoulder in the front rank of Charles's army, and you understand at last what the Hammer's whole life has been building toward. The chronicler who described this moment reached for an image so vivid it has echoed down the centuries, describing the Frankish line, standing firm as a wall, immovable as a glacier, a frozen mass of men that simply would not break. The phrase that comes down to us speaks of the Franks standing rigid as a wall of ice, and you feel the rightness of it as you take your place in that human bulwark. The shields locked, the bodies pressed close, the whole formation radiating a cold, stubborn immovability. This is the heart of Charles's plan, and to appreciate its brilliance you must understand the contrast between the two armies. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that the army of Al-Andalus was built around its cavalry, around swift, hard-hitting mounted warriors whose charges had shattered enemy after enemy across thousands of miles of conquest. These were horsemen of fearsome reputation, fast and aggressive, and on open ground they were very nearly unstoppable. Charles knew this. He had no intention of meeting them on open ground. Instead, he had chosen his position with exquisite care on wooded rising terrain that constrained the horsemen, that broke up their ability to maneuver, that funneled them toward his waiting infantry, where the trees and the slope robbed their chargers of momentum and freedom. And his infantry, oh, his infantry! You stand among them now, these hardened Frankish veterans men who had marched and fought beside Charles through years of relentless campaigning, disciplined in a way that raw levies never could be. The quirky tidbit is that this disciplined, dismounted infantry, standing firm against cavalry, was in a sense a deeply old-fashioned way of fighting, hearkening back to the infantry formations of the ancient world, even as the age of the mounted knight was supposedly dawning. There is a lovely irony in it, the Hammer winning his greatest victory not with the cavalry he is sometimes credited with championing, but with a rock-solid wall of foot soldiers who simply refused to move. The fringe footnote some historians raise is precisely this tension, questioning the old narrative that Charles was primarily a cavalry innovator when his defining triumph was won by infantry holding firm, and the debate over the true composition and tactics of his army continues to this day. You feel the formation around you, the discipline of it, the way these men have been drilled and tested until standing firm has become second nature. This is the crucial thing, the thing that will decide everything. Against a cavalry charge, infantry has one supreme task and one supreme terror. The task is to hold. The terror is the overwhelming instinct to break and run when half a ton of horse and armoured rider comes thundering toward you. If the line holds, if the men stand firm and present an unbroken wall of shields and spears, then the horses themselves will refuse to impale themselves upon it, will shy and turn aside, and the charge will break against the wall like a wave, against a cliff. But if even a few men lose their nerve and bolt, if a gap opens, then the cavalry pours through it and the whole formation unravels into slaughter. Everything, every life on that field depends on the courage and discipline of men standing still while death gallops toward them. And Charles had chosen his men and his ground precisely so that they could do exactly this. You can picture him moving along the line in the days of waiting. That magnetic presence we glimpsed in his early days, steadying his veterans, reminding them of the victories they had won together, of the trust they had in him and he in. To them, these were not strangers pressed into service, but a community of warriors bound by years of shared danger and shared triumph, and that bond was about to be tested to its absolute limit. The waiting stretched on day after day, as we saw both armies reluctant to surrender their advantage. But Charles held the stronger position, the defensive ground, and so the burden of attack fell where he wanted it upon the enemy. The forces of Al-Andalus could not simply sit forever. They had marched north to plunder and conquer, not to camp indefinitely in the cold against an immovable foe. And their commander Abd al-Rahman knew that to withdraw without a fight would squander his momentum and his prestige. And so at last the decision was made on the other side to do the one thing Charles had been praying they would do, to attack, to send those famous fearsome horsemen charging up the constrained wooded slope directly into the teeth of the frozen Frankish wall. You brace yourself now in that front rank as the ground begins to tremble. You hear it before you see it fully, the rolling thunder of hooves, the cry of the charge, the great mass of mounted warriors surging forward toward your line. Every instinct in your body screams at you to run, to flee this oncoming wall of muscle and steel. But the men beside you do not run, and so neither do you. The shields lock tighter, the spears level. The whole formation seems to hold its breath and become, just as the chronicler said, a wall of ice, a thing of cold and unyielding solidity, against which the hot fury of the charge is about to break. And here, in this frozen instant before the impact, you understand the genius of everything Charles has done. The ground he chose, the men he forged, the patience he showed, all of it converging on this single suspended moment, when a wall of foot soldiers stands firm against the cavalry that had conquered half the world, daring them to come, ready to absorb their fury and hurl it back. Historians still argue over so many details of this battle, its exact location, its true scale, the precise tactics employed. But on this central image, there is broad agreement: the Franks standing firm, the immovable wall, the discipline that would not break. So, hold the image, as tonight's fire burns low, the moment frozen just before the crash, the thunder of hooves filling the world, the wall of ice waiting, and Charles somewhere behind the line, the architect of this terrible, magnificent pound. Stillness, watching to see whether everything he has built will hold against the storm now breaking upon it. So the storm breaks, and the wall of ice holds. The first great charge of the cavalry from Al-Andalus comes thundering up the constrained slope and crashes into the frozen Frankish line, and you brace for the formation to shatter, for the gap to open, for the slaughter to begin. But it does not come. The shields hold, the spears bite, the horses faced with that unbroken, immovable wall of men, shy and turn and refuse, and the charge breaks apart against the Frankish line, just as Charles had planned, just as the discipline of his veterans had promised. You feel the shock of the impact ripple down the line, men staggering, dying, but holding the wall, absorbing the blow and remaining a wall. And then the horsemen wheel away to reform, and they charge again and again, the wall holds, and again, and this becomes the brutal, grinding rhythm of the battle. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that the forces of Al-Andalus launched repeated cavalry charges against the Frankish formation throughout the day, and that time after time, against all expectation, the Frankish infantry stood firm and threw them back. You live inside that exhausting, terrifying rhythm now, the build of thunder, the crash of impact, the desperate moments of close slaughter, and then the recoil as the horsemen pull back to charge once more. Hour after hour, charge after charge, the wall of ice refuses to melt. You can hardly grasp the endurance this demanded, the sheer physical and psychological toll of standing in that line as wave after wave of cavalry hurls itself against you, as men fall dead and wounded on every side as the day stretches on, with no end in sight and no respite from the killing. This is where Charles's years of forging his army paid their ultimate dividend. Raw levies would have broken in the first hour. These hardened veterans, bound to one another, and to Charles by years of shared war, simply would not break. The quirky tidbit that the chroniclers emphasize is precisely this astonishment that infantry could withstand such cavalry, that the supposedly unstoppable horsemen of Al-Andalus could batter themselves against the Frankish wall all day and fail to break through. It was to contemporaries very nearly miraculous. And then, as the long and bloody day wore toward its climax, the battle turned, and here we enter ground where the sources grow tangled and the historians debate fiercely. So let us tread with care. According to the accounts that come down to us at some point in the fighting, a report spread through the army of Al-Andalus that the Franks, or possibly Odo's Aquitanians, were raiding their camp, threatening the vast plunder they had accumulated on their long campaign north. The fringe footnote, and it is a genuinely debated one, is whether this was a deliberate stratagem by Charles, a detachment sent to strike the enemy camp and sow panic, or simply a rumour that spread through a tired and frustrated army. But either way, the effect was decisive. A portion of the cavalry, fearing for their loot, broke off from the battle and rode back toward the camp to protect it. What followed was the kind of confusion that decides battles. The withdrawal of part of the force toward the camp looked to others like a retreat, and in the fog and exhaustion of a long day's fighting, a partial movement to the rear can curdle into a general one with terrifying speed. And then came the blow that the chroniclers place at the very heart of the battle's turning. In the swirling fight, the commander of the army of Al-Andalus, the able and energetic Abd al-Rahman, was killed, cut down in the midst of his men. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that the death of their commander, combined with the confusion over the camp, proved catastrophic for the cohesion of his army. An army that has lost its leader, and that fears for its plunder, and that has spent itself all day against an immovable wall, is an army on the edge of collapse, and over that edge it now tumbled. As darkness fell, the fighting subsided, and both armies withdrew to their camps. Charles, ever the cautious veteran, kept his men in their disciplined formation through the night, expecting the battle to resume at dawn, suspecting perhaps a trap, refusing to let his exhausted men break ranks and scatter in pursuit. And here comes one of the strangest and most memorable details of the whole affair. When the Frankish scouts crept forward in the grey light of morning, they found the enemy camp eerily silent. The army of Al-Andalus, leaderless, demoralized, and unwilling to renew the hopeless assault against the wall of ice, had slipped away in the night, abandoning their tents and stealing back toward the south. The Franks, you are told, approached the empty camp warily, half expecting an ambush, and found only the abandoned remnants of an army that had melted away into the darkness. You can savour the strangeness of that morning, the great victorious force that had conquered half the world, simply gone, vanished, into the night, leaving Charles master of the field. Historians still argue over the precise sequence of these final events, the role of the raid on the camp, the exact circumstances of Abd al-Rahman's death, the question of whether the withdrawal was orderly or a rout, and the chronicle accounts, sparse and shaped by their authors' agendas, do not let us resolve every detail. But the essential outcome is not in doubt. The army of Al-Andalus had been defeated, its commander slain, its advance into Gaul halted and reversed, and Charles Martel stood triumphant on the field between Tours and Poitiers. The wall of ice had held. The hammer's gamble had paid off. The years of forging an army, the careful choice of ground, the iron discipline, the strategic patience, learned long ago in the forests of the East, all of it had converged on this single, exhausting, bloody day, and the result was one of the most consequential victories in the history of medieval Europe. The great conquering tide that had rolled unstoppably from Arabia to Iberia had here in the cold autumn fields of Gaul finally met a wall it could not break. So hold the image as tonight's fire burns low. The empty enemy camp in the grey dawn, the abandoned tents, the silence where an army had been. Charles standing victorious amid the wreckage of the battle, his exhausted veterans around him, the immovable wall that had held through the longest day of their lives. The invader turned back, the shrine at Tours saved, and a reputation forged. in a single day that would echo across the centuries and earn this hard, brilliant, illegitimate son of a Frankish mayor a place among the most storied figures in all of European history. So the dust settles on that field between Tours and Poitiers, and you find yourself standing amid the aftermath of a victory whose echoes will roll across more than 1,000 years of history. Charles has won. The invading army has melted away into the south. The shrine at Tours is saved, the immediate threat to the heart of Gaul lifted. But victories like this do not simply end when the fighting stops. They ripple outward, reshaping reputations, dynasties, and the very way that later ages would understand the meaning of the moment. And nowhere is this clearer than in the birth of the legend, the name, the towering historical significance that would gather around what Charles accomplished on that long autumn day. Let us begin with the immediate consequences, the practical results that mattered most to the people living through them. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that the victory enormously enhanced Charles's prestige and power across the entire Frankish world and beyond. He had done what no one else had managed. He had met the victorious force that shattered the Visigoths and crushed Duke Odo, and he had broken it. To the Franks, to the Christians of Gaul, to everyone watching the relentless expansion from the south with growing dread, Charles was now the man who had stopped the unstoppable, the shield of the realm, the defender who had stood firm when all seemed lost. There is no political capital in this age more valuable than that kind of victory. And it was around this time the chroniclers suggest that the famous name truly attached itself to him, the name by which history would forever remember him. Charles the Hammer. Martel. We touched on this before, the epithet commemorating his crushing ferocity in battle, but it is here, in the wake of this defining triumph, that the name takes on its full weight and meaning. The quirky tidbit is that the image of the hammer carries a lovely double resonance, for a hammer is both a weapon of war and a tool of the forge, and Charles was both the warrior who smashed his enemies and the craftsman who hammered a fractured realm into something stronger. Whether the name was coined immediately after this battle or attached to him gradually over the following years, the chroniclers are not entirely clear, but it is forever linked in memory to the man who hammered back the great invasion. Now we come to the part that requires the most careful handling, the question of historical significance, because here the legend grew to truly enormous proportions, and historians have spent centuries debating whether it grew too large. For a very long time, this battle was portrayed as nothing less than the salvation of Christian Europe, the decisive moment that turned back the tide and preserved Western Christendom from being overrun. The most famous expression of this view came from a great historian of a much later age, who declared in soaring prose that had Charles lost this battle, the entire future of Europe might have been utterly transformed, suggesting that the faith and learning of the continent hung in the balance on that single field. This grand narrative of a clash of civilizations, decided in an afternoon, gripped the Western imagination for generations and cemented the battle's place as one of the supposed great turning points of all history. But here the fringe footnote becomes the main event, because modern historians have substantially complicated and challenged this grand old narrative, and the debate is genuinely fascinating. Many scholars now argue that the battle, decisive and important as it was, has been considerably overrated in its world historical significance. They point out several things. First, that the force Charles defeated was very likely a large raiding expedition seeking plunder, rather than a full-scale army of conquest intent on permanently occupying Gaul. Second, that the expansion from the south had already reached the practical limits of its supply lines and logistics, far from its bases across the Pyrenees and the sea, and might well have receded regardless. And third, that the internal politics of Al-Andalus, soon convulsed by its own rebellions and divisions, would in any case have made any sustained push deep into Gaul extremely difficult. Historians still argue vigorously and without resolution whether this battle truly saved Christian Europe, or whether it was a significant but not world-altering check on an incursion that had already overextended itself. You can feel the appeal of both views, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the thoughtful middle. On one hand, it seems excessive to claim that the entire fate of European civilization hung on this one battle given how much else was in play. On the other hand, it would be equally foolish to dismiss the victory as unimportant, for it was a genuine and significant military success that turned back a powerful invading force, halted the northward momentum of the incursions into Gaul, and dramatically elevated the power of Charles and his line at a pivotal moment. What we can say with confidence is that the battle mattered enormously to the immediate fortunes of Charles and the Frankish realm, whatever we conclude about its grander civilizational stakes. And it is precisely that immediate impact, the boost to Charles's power and prestige, that proved most consequential in the long run, perhaps more so than the military outcome itself. Because the towering reputation Charles won here helped secure the dominance of his family, the family that would, within 2 generations, transform itself from mayors ruling in the name of decorative kings into kings and emperors in their own right. In that sense, whatever the precise military significance, the battle was a hinge upon which the future of a dynasty, and through that dynasty, much of European history would turn. So hold the image as tonight's fire settles into glowing coals. Charles victorious, his prestige soaring, the name of the hammer ringing across the land, the legend already beginning to crystallize around him. And around that legend, even now, the endless debate of historians weighing and reweighing the meaning of that autumn day. Some seeing the salvation of a civilization, and others seeing a significant but more modest check on an overextended raid. The truth, as so often, lies tangled somewhere in between, but the man at the center of it all stands undiminished. The illegitimate son who escaped a cell and became, by the reckoning of his own age and many ages after, the savior of his world. So you must resist the temptation, as so many tellings of this story do, to let the curtain fall on that famous autumn field, as though the victory there was the end of Charles's labours. It was not. The triumph between Tours and Poitiers was in truth less a conclusion than a midpoint, and the years that followed saw Charles undertake some of the hardest and most sustained campaigning of his entire career. Securing the south, crushing lingering threats, and extending his power into regions that had never truly bowed to Frankish authority. The hammer, having struck its most famous blow, did not rest. It kept on striking, because here is a hard truth that the legend tends to obscure. The defeat of the great invading army did not magically end the incursions from the south. Raiding parties continued to spill over the Pyrenees in the years that followed, and forces from Al-Andalus established themselves in parts of the south of Gaul, particularly along the Mediterranean coast in the region of Provence, where they found troublingly local allies willing to cooperate with them against Charles. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Charles spent much of the decade following his famous victory campaigning vigorously in the south to root out these threats and to bring the fractious southern regions firmly under his control. The work of securing the realm was never finished in a single battle, however glorious. You ride south with him now into the sun-baked country of Provence and the lower Rhône valley, where the situation had grown genuinely alarming. Some of the local nobility, chafing under Charles's expanding power and preferring their own independence, had made common cause with forces from Al-Andalus, inviting them into key cities, most notably the great old Roman city of Arles and the formidable stronghold of Avignon. The quirky tidbit here is the deep irony of it that the man celebrated as the great Christian defender against the southern incursions now found Christian nobles allying with those very forces against him. A reminder that the neat religious framing of later legend obscures a far messier reality in which political ambition and local rivalry cut across every supposedly clean divide. The world of Charles Martel was never as simple as a clash of two faiths. It was a churning mess of shifting alliances where a Christian duke might ally with a Muslim emir against a Christian hammer, all for the sake of power and survival. Charles responded to these threats with characteristic vigor and a characteristic willingness to do whatever the situation demanded. He campaigned repeatedly into the south, besieging and storming the cities that had turned against him. He retook Avignon in a hard assault and he marched against the forces holding the region, driving them back. The fringe footnote some chroniclers add, with evident disapproval, is that Charles waged these southern campaigns with a brutal thoroughness, devastating the lands of those who had defied him, and that his treatment of the rebellious city of Arles and the surrounding country was harsh enough to leave lasting scars. Historians still argue whether this brutality was simple cruelty or calculated strategy, a deliberate policy of terror meant to shatter the will of any region contemplating defiance. But either way, the southern campaigns reveal a side of Charles that the heroic legend prefers to leave in shadow. There is one particularly dramatic episode that captures the scale of these later struggles. At one point, a substantial force from Al-Andalus came north by both land and sea to support the rebellious elements in the south and to challenge Charles's growing dominance. Charles met this threat too, campaigning along the Rhone, and in a series of engagements he broke the combined opposition, driving the southern forces back and reasserting Frankish control over the region. By the end of these campaigns, Charles had not only secured the south against external incursion, but had also brought the proud and independent regions of Provence and Burgundy more firmly under his authority than ever before, weaving them into the expanding fabric of his power. You begin to see through these years of grinding southern warfare the true shape of Charles's achievement, which was about so much more than a single famous battle. He was methodically and relentlessly assembling the largest and most unified Frankish realm that had existed in generations, hammering together regions that had drifted apart, subduing the proud and the independent, and creating a base of power that stretched across an enormous swathe of Western Europe. Aquitaine brought to heel through Odo's desperation, Provence and Burgundy secured through hard campaigning, the Frisians and the Saxons and the Bavarians to the north and east repeatedly chastised and pressured. Region by region, campaign by campaign, the hammer was forging a realm. And remember Odo, the proud Duke of Aquitaine, our tragic figure from earlier. He did not long outlive his catastrophe and his humbling appeal to Charles, dying within a few years of the great battle, and upon his death, Charles moved to assert Frankish authority over Aquitaine more directly, though the proud duchy would continue to resist and chafe for generations to come. The submission Charles had extracted in Aquitaine's hour of need became one more piece of the expanding edifice of Carolingian power, even if the foundations there remained restless and uncertain. You can feel by the end of these campaigns how completely Charles had transformed his position and his realm. The escaped prisoner who began with nothing but a name now ruled in all but title over a vast and increasingly unified domain. He had defeated his Frankish rivals, turned back the great invasion, secured the troubled south, and extended his authority over proud regions that had bowed to no Frankish master in living memory. The decorative Merovingian kings still went through their pageantry, and Charles still ruled in their name, but no one could mistake where the true power lay. It lay with the hammer, and the hammer had spent his years of triumph not resting on his famous victory, but expanding and securing the realm with tireless, often ruthless energy. So hold the image as tonight's fire burns low. Charles no longer just the victor of one famous field, but the master of a great and growing realm, riding back from his southern campaigns, with the south secured behind him, the incursions repelled, the rebellious cities brought to heel. The work of the warrior nearly complete, the realm forged and hammered into shape. And ahead of him now, the subtler and in some ways more delicate work of statecraft, of religion and legitimacy and succession. The questions of how a man who ruled in another's name might secure his family's grip on power for the generations still to come. So let us turn now to one of the most fascinating and genuinely paradoxical aspects of Charles's entire career, his tangled, contradictory, deeply consequential relationship with the Church, because here you will find a man who was at once the great defender of Christendom, and in the eyes of many, churchmen a notorious plunderer of holy things, a figure who would be both celebrated as a saviour and condemned in legend to torment in the afterlife. It is a contradiction that says a great deal about the messy realities behind the heroic legend, and it deserves to be untangled with care. Begin with the unflattering side, the side the legend prefers to forget. Remember from much earlier in our story the matter of Charles seizing church lands to fund his warriors. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Charles throughout his career appropriated substantial church property, the rich estates of monasteries and bishoprics, and redistributed them to his fighting men as rewards for their loyalty and service. To Charles, this was simple necessity. Warfare was enormously expensive, and the church had accumulated vast wealth in land, and a ruler who needed to fund a powerful army naturally looked to where the wealth was. He was not by the standards of hard rulers doing anything especially unusual, but he did it on a significant scale, and he did it to institutions that kept records and held grudges. And grudges they held. Many churchmen were deeply embittered by these seizures, viewing Charles as a despoiler who had grown fat on the wealth of God's holy houses. The quirky tidbit, and it is one of the most vivid in all of medieval legend, is the famous tale that emerged in later generations. The story that Charles Martel was condemned to hell for his plundering of church property. According to this legend, when his tomb was opened, his body was found to be gone, and in its place was a dragon or a serpent, or the tomb showed signs of fire and brimstone, proof that the great hero had been dragged down to damnation for his sins against the church. You can savour the strangeness of that legend. The saviour of Christendom imagined writhing in hellfire, condemned by the very faith he had defended. The fringe footnote worth noting is that this damnation legend was almost certainly crafted by later churchmen with their own agendas, eager to make an example of a powerful ruler who had taken their lands, a cautionary tale dressed up as divine judgment, and we should treat it as legend rather than as any reflection of how Charles was viewed in his own lifetime. But here is where the paradox deepens and grows genuinely interesting, because alongside his seizures of church property, Charles also became in crucial ways a great patron and protector of the church and of Christian expansion. This is no simple contradiction to be waved away. The same man who plundered monastic estates also gave essential support to one of the most important religious enterprises of the age, the great work of Christian missionaries spreading the faith into the pagan lands of Germany to the pagan East. The most famous of these missionaries, an English churchman who would become known as the Apostle of the Germans, the great Saint Boniface, depended heavily on Charles's protection to carry out his dangerous work among the heathen tribes. Boniface himself acknowledged that without the backing and the protective authority of Charles, his mission would have been impossible, for it was Charles's power that shielded the missionaries from the hostile pagans they sought to convert. You see the calculation here, and it is a shrewd one. By supporting the missionaries, Charles was not merely serving the faith, though he may genuinely have valued that. He was also extending Frankish influence and cultural authority into the eastern lands he sought to dominate. For the spread of Christianity went hand in hand with the spread of Frankish power. Religion and politics were never separate in this world, and Charles understood, as his successors would understand even more fully, that the church could be a powerful instrument of statecraft, a means of binding conquered peoples and projecting authority far beyond what armies alone could achieve. And there is one more dimension to Charles's relationship with the church that proved enormously consequential for the future, even though Charles himself held back from fully embracing it. During his rule, the Pope in distant Rome found himself increasingly threatened by hostile powers in Italy, particularly the Lombards, and the papacy began to look northward, toward the great Frankish strongman as a potential protector. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that the Pope reached out to Charles, appealing for his aid and protection against the Lombard threat, in what was a remarkable and unprecedented gesture, the spiritual head of Western Christendom seeking the protection of the Frankish ruler. Charles, characteristically cautious and pragmatic, did not fully take up this offer. He had his own complex relationships with the Lombards, who had at times been useful allies, and he was reluctant to overextend himself into Italian affairs. So he kept the papacy at a polite distance, neither rejecting nor fully embracing the relationship. But the historians who study this moment recognize its profound significance, for Charles's hesitant courtship with the papacy planted a seed that his descendants would bring to spectacular fruit. Historians still argue over exactly how to interpret these early contacts between the Frankish house and the papacy, but few dispute that they marked the tentative beginning of an alliance that would, within a generation, utterly transform the relationship between the Frankish rulers and the church, and indeed transform the very nature of kingship in the West. So you find in Charles's dealings with the church the same complexity that runs through his whole character: the pragmatist who took what he needed and gave what served his purposes, the hard ruler who plundered holy estates and yet shielded holy missionaries, the man condemned in legend to hell, and yet celebrated as the savior of Christendom. He was no simple saint and no simple villain, but something more interesting than either a ruler navigating the tangled intersection of faith and power with cold, clear-eyed intelligence. So hold the image as tonight's fire settles low. Charles standing at the crossroads of sword and cross, plundering with one hand and protecting with the other, keeping the eager papacy at arm's length, even as he laid, all unknowing, the foundations of an alliance that would crown his grandson emperor. The hammer's relationship with the holy was complicated, contradictory, and quietly momentous, and the seeds he planted half reluctantly would blossom into one of the defining partnerships of the entire medieval age. So now you come to perhaps the most quietly astonishing dimension of Charles's whole achievement: the realization that this man, this illegitimate son, who escaped a prison cell and clawed his way to mastery of the Frankish world, was not merely the hero of his own lifetime, but the founder of a dynasty that would reshape the entire history of Europe. For Charles, Martel was the father of kings and the grandfather of an emperor, the root from which the great Carolingian tree would grow, and to understand his true significance, you must lift your eyes from his own battles and look forward to the towering figures who would build upon the foundation he laid. Let us begin with the dynasty's very name, because it carries a lovely secret. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that the great dynasty Charles founded came to be called the Carolingians, and that name derives directly from Charles himself. For the Latin form of Charles is Carolus, and the Carolingians are, quite literally, the descendants of Charles. The most famous of all those descendants, his own grandson, would bear the same name, made glorious: Charles the Great Charlemagne, whose name and fame would echo through the centuries as one of the supreme figures of medieval history. So, when you speak of the Carolingian age, of the Carolingian Renaissance, of the Carolingian Empire, that briefly united much of Western Europe, you are speaking in the end of the house that Charles Martel built. The quirky tidbit is that the man who gave his name to this world-shaping dynasty never himself bore a crown, never called himself king ruling, always in the careful fiction of mayor to the decorative Merovingians, and yet his name became the name of emperors. You can trace the line forward and feel the momentum of it. Charles had several sons, and upon laying the groundwork for his succession, he passed his power not to a Merovingian king but to his own offspring, as though the realm were his family's possession to bequeath, which by now, in all but legal theory, it was. His sons, particularly the two named Pepin and Charlemagne, inherited his position and his power, continuing the family's dominance over the Frankish world. And it was one of these sons, Pepin, called Pepin the Short, who would take the final decisive step that Charles himself had held back from. The fringe footnote worth savouring is the contrast between father and son here, for where Charles was content to wield royal power without the royal title, his son Pepin was not, and the difference would prove momentous, because Pepin the Short did what no Frankish mayor had dared to do. He reached out to that very papacy his father had kept at arm's length, and he asked the Pope a pointed question whether it was right that the man who held the real power should not also hold the royal title, while a powerless, do-nothing king sat decoratively upon the throne. And the Pope, who needed a powerful Frankish protector against his enemies in Italy, gave Pepin the answer he wanted. With papal blessing, the last of the decorative Merovingian kings was deposed, packed off to a monastery with his famous long hair very likely shorn, and Pepin himself was raised up as king of the Franks. Anointed with holy oil, in a sacred ceremony that bound the new dynasty to the church in a way that would define medieval kingship for centuries. The line that Charles founded had at last claimed the crown openly. You see now the full architecture of what Charles set in motion, even if he did not live to witness its completion. His victories and his power made his family the unquestioned masters of the Frankish world. His tentative contacts with the papacy opened the door through which his son would walk to claim a crown blessed by the church, and the throne his son seized would pass in time to his grandson, the great Charlemagne, who would expand the realm to encompass much of Western Europe, who would be crowned emperor in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800, reviving the imperial dignity of the West that had lain dormant since the fall of Rome centuries before. Historians still argue over how much credit Charles Martel deserves for these later glories. Whether he was the indispensable architect of Carolingian greatness, or merely a powerful warlord whose ambitious descendants happened to build something far grander than he envisioned. Have been no Pepin upon the throne, no Charlemagne wearing the imperial crown, no Carolingian age at all. There is something profound to sit with here in the long shadow that Charles cast across the future. Think back to where this story began, to that inconvenient infant born to a controversial union, the illegitimate son regarded as a problem to be solved, imprisoned and dismissed by his own family, written off entirely by those who held power, and then trace the line forward from that dismissed child to a grandson crowned emperor in Rome, to a dynasty that would give its name to an entire age of European history, to a foundation upon which much of medieval civilization would be built. The asterisk beside Charles's name at birth, the mark of illegitimacy that nearly cost him everything, faded into utter insignificance beside the towering edifice his blood would raise. And it is worth pausing on the strangeness of how power was transmitted in this remarkable family across 3 generations. Charles wielded royal power without the title. His son Pepin seized the title to match the power. His grandson Charlemagne elevated that title to the imperial dignity of an emperor. Each generation reached higher than the last, climbing a ladder whose first rung was set in place by the hard, brilliant, illegitimate hammer who began it all. The chroniclers who recorded these events understood that they were witnessing the rise of a truly extraordinary dynasty, and they traced its greatness rightly back to the man whose name it bore. So hold the image as tonight's fire burns low. Charles Martel, the father of kings, the grandfather of an emperor, the root of the Carolingian tree looking forward, though he could not have known it toward a future in which his descendants would wear crowns and imperial purple and reshape the map of Europe. The illegitimate son who was once locked away in a cell had founded a line that would rule for generations and lend its name to an age. And he did it all without ever wearing a crown himself. The kingmaker who made his family into kings, the hammer whose blows forged not just a realm but a dynasty that would echo down the centuries. So now we come to the closing chapter of Charles's own life, to the final years of the man who had risen from a prison cell to the mastery of the Frankish world. And there is something fitting, something almost gentle in the way the great hammer's story draws toward its end. For all his battles and his hardness and his tireless campaigning, Charles was granted what many men of his violent age were denied the chance to grow old, to set his affairs in order, and to die, not on some bloody field, but in his bed, having secured his family's future with the same careful foresight that had marked his whole career. By the late 730s, Charles had grown into an old man, by the standards of his time, his body, worn by decades of warfare and ceaseless campaigning, the long years of marching and fighting, taking their inevitable toll. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that in his final years Charles reached the very summit of his power, so dominant that when the last of the decorative Merovingian kings died, around the year 737, Charles did not even bother to install a replacement. The throne simply sat empty, and Charles ruled on without any king at all in his own name as the undisputed master of the Franks. You can feel the weight of that detail. The fiction of Merovingian kingship that had cloaked the family's power for so long had grown so threadbare that Charles no longer troubled to maintain it. The do-nothing kings on their ox carts were finished, and no one rose to object. It is a striking testament to how completely Charles had transformed his position. The man who had once been imprisoned by a stepmother, guarding child heirs, now ruled a vast realm so absolutely that he left the royal throne vacant for years, governing as a king in everything but name. The quirky tidbit is the irony that Charles, who had every opportunity in these final years to simply claim the crown for himself, never did so, leaving that final decisive step for his son to take. Why he held back we cannot fully know. Perhaps caution, perhaps a respect for tradition, perhaps a sense that the time was not quite ripe. Historians still argue over why Charles refrained from claiming the crown when his power was so total, and the question lingers as one of the intriguing puzzles of his career. As his strength faded, Charles turned to the essential business of arranging his succession, and here he made decisions that reveal both his foresight and perhaps a certain blindness to the dangers of division. Following the long Frankish custom of dividing inheritance among sons, Charles partitioned his realm between his two principal sons by his first wife, the brothers Pepin and Charlemagne. To Charlemagne the elder, he assigned the eastern heartland of Austrasia, along with the regions to its east. To Pepin the younger, he gave the western lands of Neustria, Burgundy, and Provence. The fringe footnote some historians raise is the question of Charles's other sons, including a younger son named Grifo, born to a second wife whose claims would spark conflict after Charles's death. For the neat division between the two elder brothers did not satisfy everyone, and the seeds of future strife were sown even in Charles's careful planning. You feel in this dividing of the realm the perennial weakness of the Frankish system, the way that even the greatest accumulations of power were repeatedly broken apart among heirs, sowing the seeds of fresh conflict with each generation. Charles had spent his whole life hammering a fractured realm into unity, and now at the end he divided that hard-won unity between his sons, trusting that they would rule it well together. In the event, the brothers did cooperate for a time, but the partition reflected a structural fragility in Frankish governance that would trouble the dynasty for generations. The eternal tension between the impulse to unite and the custom to divide. And then in the autumn of the year 741, the great hammer's long life came to its end. Charles Martel died. The chroniclers tell us at one of his estates, an old man, worn out by his years of struggle, and he was laid to rest in the great abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, the same hallowed ground where the kings of France would later be buried for centuries to come. There is a quiet significance in that resting place, for by being interred at Saint-Denis, Charles was honoured as a ruler of the first rank, buried among the great, his bones laid in a place reserved for the truly mighty. The very monastery whose lands he had perhaps drawn upon to fund his wars became the keeper of his eternal rest, a final, fitting irony in the life of the man who plundered and protected the church in equal measure. You can pause here and reflect on the arc of that remarkable life as it closes. The illegitimate infant, the imprisoned youth, the defeated claimant, the patient builder, the brilliant commander, the saviour of his realm, the father of a dynasty. All of it gathered now into the still figure laid to rest at Saint-Denis. He had taken the power his father built, lost it, won it back, expanded it beyond anything his father had achieved, and passed it on to sons who would in their turn raise the family to royal and imperial heights. He died as he had lived in command, having shaped the world around him to his will across nearly 3 decades of struggle and triumph. And yet, even in death, Charles's story was not entirely at peace, for it was after his death that the legends of his damnation of the empty tomb and the serpent and the hellfire would grow and circulate, the embittered churchmen having their posthumous revenge upon the man who took their lands. The saviour of Christendom condemned in legend to torment, even as his body rested in honour among the great at Saint-Denis. The contradictions of his life followed him beyond the grave, the hero and the plunderer, the defender and the despoiler forever entwined. So hold the image as tonight's fire burns down to embers. Charles Martel, old and worn, his realm divided among his sons, his long struggle finally ended, laid to rest in the hallowed ground of Saint-Denis among the mighty of the earth. The hammer stilled at last, the great life closed the dynasty he founded, poised to rise to heights he would never see. The man who began with nothing but a name and an asterisk had reshaped his world, and now his work complete, he passed into the quiet of history and into the tangled, enduring legend that would carry his name across the centuries. So, we arrive at the final reckoning, the place where you stand back from the whole sweep of this extraordinary life and ask the deep questions. What it all meant, how an illegitimate son became the unlikely savior of Christian Europe, and what, the historians peering back across more than 13 centuries, make of the man and his legend today. For Charles, Martel is not merely a figure of his own age, but a figure who has been argued over, celebrated, mythologized, and reassessed by every generation that came after. And his legacy is as tangled and fascinating as the man himself. Begin with the sheer improbability of the whole story, because it is worth dwelling on one last time. The mainstream historical fact to hold here is that Charles transformed himself from a marginalized, illegitimate son, imprisoned and dismissed, into the most powerful man in Western Europe and the founder of one of history's most consequential dynasties. And he did it through a combination of military genius, political shrewdness, relentless determination, and a refusal to accept the fate that others assigned to him. There is something almost mythic in the shape of that ascent, the dismissed bastard who became the hammer of his age, the prisoner who became the maker of kings. It is the kind of story that, were it fiction, you might dismiss as too neat, too dramatic, and yet it happened more or less, as the chroniclers describe, give or take the embellishments of later tellers. But let us hold one final time the great central debate that hangs over his legacy, the question of whether he truly saved Christian Europe. The quirky tidbit worth revisiting is how dramatically Charles's reputation has swung across the centuries. To medieval chroniclers and to the historians of later ages, he was the towering Christian hero, the defender of the faith who turned back the tide at Tours and preserved Western Christendom from being overwhelmed. This grand image gripped the imagination for generations, casting Charles as one of the great saviors of European civilization. The man without whom it was claimed the whole future of the continent might have been utterly different. His victory was elevated to one of the supposed decisive moments of all world history, a hinge upon which the fate of nations turned. And yet, as we have seen, modern scholarship has substantially complicated this heroic portrait. Many historians now argue that the significance of his most famous battle has been considerably overstated, that the force he defeated was likely a large raid rather than a campaign of conquest, that the southern expansion had already reached its practical limits, and that the grand narrative of a civilization saved in a single afternoon owes more to the romantic imagination of later ages than to the realities of the 8th century. The fringe footnote, and it is an uncomfortable one, is that Charles's image as a Christian champion has at times been appropriated by those seeking to frame history as an eternal clash of civilizations, a use of his memory that distorts the far messier reality we have traced, in which Christian nobles allied with Muslim emirs, in which politics and ambition cut across every supposedly clean religious divide, in which Charles himself plundered the church even as he defended it. Historians still argue, and will likely argue forever, over exactly how to weigh his significance. And the honest answer is that the truth lies somewhere in the contested middle ground between hero and overrated warlord. So how then should you remember him as the embers of this long journey burn down? Perhaps the fairest reckoning is this: Charles Martel was not single-handedly the savior of a civilization, for no one man ever is, and the forces of history are always larger than any individual. But he was beyond any reasonable doubt one of the most capable and consequential figures of the entire early medieval period. A brilliant commander, a shrewd statesman, and the indispensable founder of a dynasty that would reshape the map and the culture of Europe. Whether or not his famous battle saved Christendom, his life unquestionably laid the foundation for the Carolingian age, for the reign of Charlemagne, for the revival of empire in the West, and for much of what would follow in medieval European history. His true monument is not a single battle but a dynasty, not a single afternoon but the centuries his bloodline shaped. And there is a final, deeper truth in his story that transcends all the debates about military significance, a truth about the strange and unpredictable workings of history itself. Think one last time of where he began, the inconvenient infant with the asterisk beside his name, the boy, his own family regarded as a problem, the young man locked in a cell and written off entirely. By every expectation of his age, he should have vanished into obscurity, just another illegitimate son, swallowed by the brutal politics of a violent world. Instead, through sheer force of will and talent, he rose to remake his world and to found a line of emperors. The lesson, if there is one, is that history is full of such improbable turns, that the dismissed and the underestimated can sometimes reshape the destiny of nations, and that the labels others place upon us at birth need not determine where we end. So let the great story come to rest now. The hammer is long stilled, the battles long ended, the dynasty he founded risen and fallen and passed into the deep memory of the past. And as we release Charles Martel back into the quiet of history, let us begin gently to release ourselves as well, to let the cold Frankish forests and the clamour of ancient battle fade softly away into the dark. The fires of the war camps are burning low now, the last embers glowing and dimming on the autumn fields, where the great armies once clashed, and the smoke rises thin and grey into a sky, going quiet with the coming of night. The clash of iron has fallen silent, the thunder of hooves long faded, and the wall of ice that held so firm has melted at last into the gentle mist of memory, leaving the field still and peaceful beneath the gathering stars. The proud duke and the northern hammer, the rivals and the kings, the missionaries and the emperors, all of them are sleeping now, resting in the deep and untroubled stillness of the past. Their struggles ended, their long roads finally come to rest. You can feel the centuries settling softly over it all like a warm and weightless blanket, the ancient world growing dim and distant, the voices of the long dead fading to a whisper, and then to silence. There is nothing left to fear now, no battle still to fight, no enemy at the gate, only the soft hush of history at peace with itself. The great hammer has set down his work, and so too may you set down the weight of your own day, here in the warmth and safety of your own bed, far from the cold forests and the clamour of war, wrapped in the gentle quiet of the present moment. The stars are dimming overhead, the world is growing soft and still, and everything that once burned so fiercely has cooled into the calm of remembrance. The past is at rest, and so may you be. The world is quiet now, wonderfully, perfectly quiet, and it is time at last to let yourself drift down into deep and peaceful sleep.